Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Online Ethics Center's Fall 2023 webinar series, Bringing Ethics to the Conversation. We're so glad that you are here, and we're so glad and so happy that Dr. DeLeo can join us this morning. My name is Azita Hirsa. I'm a teaching professor at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute School of Engineering in the Industrial Systems Engineering Department, where I teach courses in management of engineering technology, ethics of modeling, engineering ethics, and professional development, technical issues and solutions. I'm also the chair of the ethics division at the American Society of Engineering Education, the ASEE, and thrilled to be the webinar host for OEC's 2023-24 seasons. The Online Ethics Center is a digital repository for resources on teaching and learning about ethics in engineering and science. The OEC also fosters a community of faculty, students, researchers, and other professionals who come together to discuss ethics. Please check out our website online at onlineethics.org. The theme for the fall webinar series is engineering ethics in industry. I'm delighted to host our speaker today, Dr. Paul DeLeo. Dr. DeLeo serves as a senior director of the chemical management at the American Chemistry Council. Over the past 25 years, his career has focused on applied research and advocacy related to human and environmental safety of food ingredients, pesticides, drugs, cosmetics, and cleaning products. During that time, he has worked at the Office of the Food Additive Safety, U.S. Food Drug Administration from 1999 to 2007, the American Cleaning Institute, 2007 to 2017, and as a consultant to the chemical manufacturers and users regarding the safety of their ingredients and products from 2017 to 2021. He shares his professional passion for consumers' occupational and general population exposure to chemicals in commerce as an active member of the American Industrial Hygiene Association, the International Society for Exposure Science, the Society for Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry, and the Society of Toxicology, and has published a dozen articles in those topic areas in the peer-reviewed scientific literature over the past decade. Dr. DeLeo completed his Ph.D. in environmental microbiology at Cornell University and his master's degree in environmental engineering at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. After Dr. DeLeo's talk, he will take questions. To ask a question, please type in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat box, and I'll read it to him. Audience members will not be able to use their microphones and cameras. Dr. DeLeo, thank you so much for joining us. And it's really interesting how we met. We were actually at an EPA discussion on the use of methylene chloride. So I'm so thrilled that you're here and will be talking to us about scientific integrity.
Thanks so much, Azita. It's a pleasure to be here today. And as part of this conversation, talking about scientific integrity and probably more specifically about when that is challenged. You gave an introduction regarding my background, and I just want to share a little bit more just on the perspective that I feel I have a pretty good breadth of experience from academia, mostly as a graduate student with government, working within government. And so I've dealt with some of these challenges firsthand in a public health setting. And most recently, in the last 15 or so years, working primarily in business, but the interface between business and government for public health kind of reasons and activities. I also wanted to talk a little bit about my organization, the American Chemistry Council, because that's a lens through which my discussion can be sort of considered. So the American Chemistry Council, it's an industry trade association. We've got somewhere around the 100. Hi, did I drop off there, Azita?
No, you're good. You're back on.
Yeah,
Your slides are gone.
I was having this challenge with Zoom that is appearing again. All right, let me try this again. I think it's the screen share mode with Zoom and PowerPoint that, let's see if it works better for me now. All right. So, again, ACC, American Chemistry Council, we're a trade association. We represent most of the major manufacturers of companies that are in the business of chemistry. So you can think of large multinationals. It's a, chemical industry obviously is a huge part of the economy, and they're an important employer in the U.S. We have a staff on the order of 160 here in the U.S., and our programmatic portfolio deals with things like chemical management, so chemical safety issues, also chemical security, a lot around that, particularly following the events of 9/11 and making sure that chemical facilities are safe from all sorts of potential threats. And then sustainability, as you might imagine, is a big topic of consideration. So a lot of my work is in the space of what we would call advocacy, and that's generally working with agencies, typically U.S. federal agencies, on issues related to the chemical industry and the regulation of that industry. I work an awful lot with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. We also have a big portion of our my colleagues work in the space of lobbying. I am not a lobbyist. I occasionally lobby. The distinction there is that you're going to legislators, whether they be in the federal government or at the state level, and trying to influence legislation. I do that from time to time, but I'm not a registered lobbyist. But part of the point I want to make here is that we are, often seen as a monolith, of chemical industry, and I think there are perceptions of what goes on in industry and what that might look like. And that's going to be part of the discussion here today, sort of showing, different sides of particular issues. But I just wanted to acknowledge that, at the outset here, that there are definitely cases where my organization is not portrayed in the most favorable light. But I think one thing we would point to is that chemistry is integral to the economy. Everything you touch is made of chemicals. And at the end of the day, I think all of us are looking to have healthy and fulfilling lives, and hopefully working in the same direction for those goals. The other thing I wanted to talk about, again, thinking about scientific integrity and some of the challenges there, is that in this particular point in history, we are witnessing an economic transformation that is just incomparable in scale. When you think about decarbonization of energy systems, so we're going to get rid of hydrocarbons for energy. That's something that's been used for thousands of years. We've used sources of hydrocarbon to power things. We're, again, moving away from carbon-based energy systems to an entirely electric infrastructure. And so there's a lot of technological changes, infrastructural changes that go along with that. And then likewise, we're looking at a fully circular economy, moving toward that. And so all these dramatic economic transformations come with lots of great ideas, but not always a lot of agreement, and conflict is inevitable as we have differences of opinion regarding how to achieve these necessary goals. So I'm going to sort of narrow down into from this big context to a more specific case that we can use to think about how we deal with some areas of this area of conflict, potential conflict. So in the realm of circular economy, for the plastic sector, one thing that is being developed now is chemical recycling of plastics. So if you look at this small diagram, mechanical recycling is something we've been aware of and have been using for decades. I can say during my graduate experience at RPI in the early 90s, the idea of chemical recycling of plastics was something the staff there was working on. And it's been decades in the making, but where we find ourselves at a point in time where we can take commingled non-recyclable waste, plastic waste, and turn it into feedstocks for new products. So that's, I think, a promising and necessary technology, but again, a technology that is not without concerns and challenges. So in particular, there are a number of potential technologies. I want to focus on a specific one, pyrolysis. So heating of a substance in a oxygen-free atmosphere. This is one that allows circular use of plastic building blocks. You can break down, mixed, commingled, non-recyclable plastic and turn it into an oil, pyrolysis oil that can be used. In some cases, it's blended with fuel, but in other cases, it's blended with virgin material. And I think the hope is that one day you'll have complete circularity and being able to use that pyrolysis oil to make new products. By recycling these feedstocks, you're reducing dependence on fossil resources, and also enhancing the commercialization of these plastics that are not recycled. A limited portion of plastics are actually recyclable, even though they have different markings, but the reality is a small portion. At the end of the day, a small portion is recycled, and so you're capturing a bigger portion of that waste stream that is currently not being recycled and that is potentially accumulating. With any technology, there are trade-offs and challenges. As yet, this is still nascent but growing technology. It's still needs to be fully proven. It's capital intensive. There are, I think, concerns about environmental performance. Is it as good as advertised? Will it be carbon neutral? Are you, using more energy than you're saving? Are you just perpetuating unsustainable practices? Concerns that the role of plastics in the economy. And one thing I wanted to provide for the audience here is there's a link here to kind of a vignette, a short video that my organization put together about a particular manufacturer that is currently commercializing pyrolysis in the use of plastic recycling. And I'm going to give you the contrast here in a second to set things up, but I wanted to offer that as an opportunity for something to see, because folks might not be familiar with the specifics of this individual technology and how it might ultimately be used. So in terms of setting up a conflict, a potential challenge to scientific integrity, there's a recent case and a couple of articles in certain online sources talking about advanced recycling and chemical recycling of plastic, and concerns that it's generating toxic waste and greater emissions than the benefits might provide. There's a ProPublica story about a review by the Environmental Protection Agency of some of the chemicals coming out of this process. And just to give you a little background, the Environmental Protection Agency reviews and permits new chemicals in commerce, and these pyrolysis oils are considered new chemicals. So in the course of the last 2 or 3 years, a group of employees at the EPA reached out to a public health non-governmental organization called the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, under a whistleblower, as whistleblowers about a particular application that was before the agency, and alleged that their managers were revising their risk assessments about this process, that they were deleting language identifying potential adverse effects in the reviews that they were conducting, that their reports were being revised with conclusions that indicated that there were no toxicity concerns despite data to the contrary, and that they were being retaliated against, basically reassigned, and that the assessments were being assigned to more inexperienced employees, so they'd be easier to manipulate, kind of thing. So you have this case of a series of employees, frontline employees, looking at the safety of a technology, finding that they're in conflict with their managers. Their managers, being supervisors, have the ability to adapt the final product, and by virtue of their opinion of how things ultimately worked out, they ended up reaching out to different public outlets and bringing their experience to light. So to really have to come to this, again, I've worked in a government setting, a public health agency, the Food and Drug Administration. I've actually been involved in cases like this. I think at the end of the day, you can extrapolate this certainly beyond the government agencies. In any science-based, engineering-based organization, private, public, you're going to be making decisions. And the question is, you're going to have a lot of, really smart people with different opinions. How are you handling these differences of opinions? Are there practices that can be implemented so that all parties and stakeholders are satisfied when there are these differences of opinion? And when is it appropriate to, blow the whistle, essentially look for an outside source to go to bring into a process? So one approach, and I think it's pretty consistently used in, again, federal agencies, is around scientific integrity and programs, policies regarding scientific integrity. So recently, the White House put out a guidance document for the entire federal government on how science-based agencies should be protecting scientific integrity. There are obviously significant aspects regarding the free flow of information, the protection of workers from retaliation and negative consequences by virtue of their expressing their scientific opinion, dealing with aspects of accountability, and established processes for coming to science-based decisions. The culture around an organization is very important as to, with respect to how these kinds of things are implemented. But then at the end of the day, a lot of agencies that are dealing with public health policy are making decisions of one kind or another. So do I permit, a new drug onto the market? Do I permit a new chemical onto the market? Do I allow a factory to emit, a certain level of pollutants in its stack? All of those decisions need to be made in a transparent way, and you have to have systems in place to make sure that how that decision-making process occurs is transparent. So before I get into the specifics on that, I did want to make a contrast to things that are, beyond the scope of scientific integrity and that are clearly areas where, if you are aware of these sorts of things, you probably have an obligation in your organization to speak up, whether it's internally or potentially externally, thinking of things like, just clear misconduct, fraud, political interference on a process, retaliation, and actually the one that I think was potentially the umbrella under which this particular case may have fallen under, that the employees may have perceived, is that there are, again, in a public health agency, if there are unaddressed significant risks, there's an obligation to, raise those kinds of questions. I think the idea here is, though, these are pretty black and white, and you would it should be apparent if someone is, embezzling money, or you've got people who don't belong in the process are allowed to pull strings and affect decision making that way. But I really want to spend more time talking about the more nuanced aspect of scientific differences of opinion. So in most organizations, you're going to have your front level employees who are doing the nuts and bolts of work. You work in a team. You've got supervisory chain of command, and then at the end of the day, you're coming to some kind of decision about might be moving a product forward or other kinds of assessments. And I think it's important. This is a scheme that comes from an EPA document on how differences of opinion should be resolved. So I think it's important here that you've got a number of opportunities to work within a team, to work with subject matter experts. You're generally going to have management tiers of management. You may have it may be necessary as well to seek advice from a scientific integrity office. I think this notion of having different outlets where these kinds of issues can be discussed are present. And I'm again thinking of the audience here. I'm assuming there are a number of students who are considering, what do I do after I complete my degree and get into the working world. I think it's important to think about, you're likely, I'm imagining the students that are participating in this are likely to be in, again, high functioning organizations with folks with a lot of opinions. And does that organization have mechanisms by which these kinds of differences of opinion can be, handled in a respectful way, in a professional way? And is there an opportunity, if you have a negative opinion, to sort of keep that on the record, and is that approach respected? So in this model, you have your internal deliberations before you go to the decision making, and this opportunity for documentation of a differing opinion. Your process may also have a scientific peer review, and I think that's helpful as well if these issues are allowed to come to light for other groups, whether that be an internal peer review or an external peer review. If it's a really important decision, there should be cases where these mechanisms are part of the process. But I think one thing is, so first of all, it's a question, do you have these systems, these processes in place? Generally, differences, dissenting opinions, documenting dissenting opinions in a public health kind of context is not going to be real popular. So I want to talk a little bit about, it's great to have these things on paper, but there are still, the realities of a system. Does this really work? It's human nature that conflict often isn't popular in professional settings. It can be frowned upon. Certainly having internal dissension is frowned upon. And then, especially if it's, some kind of decision and then this becomes public, it's going to be, those who don't like the decision are going to point to, you look at your own internal staff. They don't agree with you, or this person doesn't agree with you. I think it is important to have a structure where it is, you can address opinions, but you have to be prepared that as a sort of a someone who's not the decision maker, your advice may not be taken, or you may be overridden, even if you get a chance to be heard. And then you have to acknowledge that the outcome of a decision may not please everyone. So part of my thinking here is that you want to go into this kind of understand with open eyes that this is kind of how life kind of works. I think it's important to have the process in place like this. It's important to be able, for folks to be able to document their dissenting opinions. That's probably a very good step in terms of, avoiding external, sort of whistleblowers scenarios. But at the end of the day, you may be heard even if you don't, necessarily agree with the outcome at hand. So before I move on, I just want to again sort of emphasize that, thinking about places, work environments that one could find themselves in, it's going to be important to understand whether there's systems in place, how they're used, the culture. Does the culture allow this kind of academic discussion or dissension potentially around issues, and then how is that dissension handled and dealt with? Again, sort of going back to the beginning, if you understand that complex situations are going to result in varying degrees of agreement, sort of acknowledging they're going to have that conflict, you can sort of prepare yourself and expect that there's going to be cases where there's dissension, and just being accepting of that dissension, but understanding at the end of the day, you've got to make decisions and move forward. I think that's going to be, a cultural aspect that's, not always easily taken up, but something folks should be aware of and thinking about. So the other, one other thing I wanted to sort of touch on here, that's, sort of relatively new, certainly new in my career, is, the role of social media and the fact that science tends to be very deliberative, sometimes slow moving, but social media is instantaneous. You do things in real time. Likewise, in terms of decision making, often the deliberation occurs internally, and then you have a final outcome that people may only see that final outcome. Well, social media might pull back the curtain on all that deliberation, and it's kind of that sausage making analogy where it may not be real pretty, and that may not be what you want to be seen from your organization. You want to focus on, okay, we came to a decision at the end of the day. So this is going to be a challenge of social media, providing transparency on that kind of internal activity. Lastly, all sorts of business requires information control. You have confidential business information, you have trade secrets, you may have, you may be working in a confidential security situation where, certain information can't be transferred. While social media allows one to disseminate information broadly and instantaneously, and maybe a real challenge to control that information, I think more importantly, it can be very dangerous, to you as an individual, the intersection of social media and your workplace, and that you can certainly intentionally, but maybe unintentionally disclose something that is not appropriate to disclose, and find yourself in all sorts of jeopardies, whether it's with your job or with your freedom, so to speak. I think more, sort of a broader brush, the expectations, I think expectations have been changing, and folks that are students, this was not an issue when I was a student so much that you could so easily disclose internal information. And now I think there are different expectations on what transparency looks like. And so it's really important to consider kind of the role of social media in how scientists and engineers do their work, and probably warrants some consideration and some filtering of how one presents themselves in a public space and uses social media in a professional setting. So I just want to wrap up here real quick with a couple takeaways. Again, scientific integrity systems are critical, and that's to say, those of you who are thinking about your workplace, there should be an acknowledgement, if you're working in a science or engineering-based workplace, that there's some that these systems exist. You know what they are. You know who to talk to about them, because inevitably issues are going to come up that have to be addressed under that rubric. Their differences of opinion are going to be inevitable, again, in high functioning organizations. And so before you get to that, you really want to have a process that everyone understands and where everyone can be heard. And if there's not a satisfactory outcome, at least everyone's had the opportunity to be heard and it can feel acknowledged that they've been heard. That being said, I think you have to be realistic about what to expect. In most organizations are hierarchical. Your scientific or engineering opinion might be one of many. You may be overruled by a committee, by a group of experts, by your supervisor. In many cases, that's going to be appropriate for how a group works, and hopefully you've got the systems in place where your opinion is taken into account and you don't feel that you have to go outside the system. Certainly, if there are cases of, again, clear misconduct or fraud, you have an obligation to do that. But I feel like in a lot of situations, it's more about differences of opinion of how things should go forward and how your organization or its culture handle that, and making sure that you acknowledge that that's going to happen, and there's a way for everyone to be heard and for things to be addressed. And then finally, I think modern sensibilities about information use challenge how the deliberative nature of science, and we're seeing that play out in real time. And I think that's something that folks want to be sensitive of and aware of in your workplace and in the places where you operate professionally. So I just got a list of some of the resources that I've worked from if folks have interest in these federal policies in particular. If you want to look in more detail on how some of these organizations handle scientific integrity and resolving differences of opinion. But I think that's all I have then, Azita, if you want to field some questions for us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Really appreciate this. I don't see any questions right now, and I guess the audience are probably writing their questions in the chat. But I do have a question for you. As we were talking about transparency, certainly one of the things that you said is science sort of takes its time, and social media is right away, right? So it's immediate. Is there a happy medium in there somewhere? Is there a way that we can bring these two together where information doesn't get out and destroy people's lives overnight, and that we don't take so much time trying to reach the goals that we need to reach?
Yeah, that's a real challenge. I mean, I think, again, it's sort of hard when information is coming out in dribs and drabs. It's probably more a case of understanding the time points at which maybe information is disseminated in a fashion. Again, I'm thinking of sort of processes that I work in, generally government processes where you know when to expect a report, a document, and all the underlying data to come out. I don't think it's necessarily helpful for things to come out one at a time. So again, it kind of goes back to process, and I don't know the extent to which organizations are adapting to that speed, but that's probably where you would want to start, is understanding processes for making information publicly available and setting expectations for the stakeholder audience on when they would see things, and then following through on that. So I don't know if that's a that's a little bit of a kind of a general response, but I think that's how you'd want to respond to handle something like that.
Right, right. You also talked about culture and understanding culture and communicating that culture. So in your experience, how different are these cultures from one organization, one entity to another? And how do they come to terms and negotiate these cultures?
Right. Yeah. So my experience, I've worked in a couple of different government settings, and if you again remember, in the federal government, you're talking about millions of employees. You're talking about basically a military structure, very hierarchical. There you have a lot people with a lot of experience. So in those cases, the culture can be pretty rigid. And it's hard to change because of the nature of government organizations, where they know they've got taxpayers who are interested in what they're doing, the regulated community that's interested in what they're doing. They got a lot of eyes on them. More recently, I've worked in smaller organizations. You can be more nimble, but also you may not have the depth of experience, and there may not be as nimble as people may be and as thoughtful as people may be. There's not necessarily the same level of resources to set up some of these systems and make sure that people are being heard. So there definitely trade-offs, and some of it has to do with organizational structure. The organization I'm in now is actually pretty flat. And also, again, it's both structural and cultural, where if we're dealing with some kind of position that we're going to put out, how we're going to present ourselves, there's usually a lot of people that are part of the discussion. It may happen quickly, and I can inject my thoughts on how we should be approaching things. But I've also got a lot of colleagues that are very opinionated, if you will, have a lot of ideas. So it's a little less formal, but you're in a position where you've got to make yourself heard. And if you're not happy with how things shake out, it to some extent it's on you to be the one to advocate for yourself. So again, it's a smaller organization, maybe less structure. There's lots of opportunity, but you've got to be your own advocate and be prepared to do that. And I think until you've spent some time in different organizations, it's probably hard to gauge how to do that. You kind of got to figure it out as you go along on some level.
Right. We also talked about the audience, and I know part of what you were talking about was geared towards the students that are going out there and dealing with things that are happening in industry. What about the other audience? So as academics, what would you like us to take away, or folks that may be from other agencies within the government or industry? What are some thoughts for them to take away?
Yeah, so the activities I deal with have a lot of academics present. I think the academics bring a ton, to the table. I'm not always certain, they're idealistic, they're cutting edge, they're not necessarily practical. And I think in terms, again, in the world I work in, you really have to make an investment to understand the process. You can't expect, I'm coming from Stanford or, one of the RPI or, a really high-end institution, and then automatically people are going to listen to me. I deal with issues where it's, years, if not decades of interaction with a particular agency, understanding how they work. And this goes to your point of change. I'm dealing with a process now that's been around probably since the 80s. And we're constantly talking to the agency about updating, how they approach things. And I've finally realized they might do that, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. So now I've got to change what I'm bringing to them so that it fits, meet them where they're at. And, I think I'm not sure, the academics necessarily bring that sort of thinking to the table. And I think they get frustrated with it, even though the approaches folks are talking about may not fit the needs of the audience there. You can present that, but I think you also have to find a way to make your ideas work for the audience to which you're presenting them in those public policy kinds of settings. So I know it's probably a little vague, but and I don't want to be pejorative to academics, but I'll talk about one activity. I mean, one of the scientific societies I work with specifically had developed guidance, if you will, on, well, it kind of goes both ways. It's speaking to the researchers on how you can do your research so that it's more useful in a regulatory setting. And it also speaks to the regulator on how you can take academic data. And I'll contrast this with a lot of the data we do for regulatory activities. It's like you have to go to a specific, protocol and run that protocol, and then the agency will accept the data with particular quality control, aspects. You checked all those boxes. Well, then you have an academic researcher that does a novel study, and the regulatory body is like, well, what do I do with this? So trying to train, both parties, again, to sort of meet in the middle where, what kind of mechanisms do you have to have in your research so that the regulator, it's going to resonate with the regulators and they know what to do with it. And same with the regulators. How do you interpret, a peer-reviewed article? It's like you may not necessarily be able to go back to that researcher. How do I use that in a way, use it and not just discount it because it doesn't fit neatly into the box that we typically use for our data sources.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We do have a question from a philosophy professor who teaches ethics in engineering and computer science undergraduates. Do you have any set of positive and negative case studies in the kind of organizational scientific integrity you're discussing today that you would be, that we could have access to?
I mean, most of this is anecdotal. I'm not in sort of the business of, publishing these kinds of case studies. Again, anecdotally, if I get a chance to visit the university, I certainly could, over a drink, talk about lots of case studies. I think I guess the challenge I would have is if you look in the media, there's a certain narrative in the media, and usually the narrative doesn't reflect the complexity of a lot of these situations. They're not always so black and white with the hero vanquishing the nasty polluter or whatever. There's a lot more going on. That certainly happens, but there's life is a lot more complicated than that. The other thing I've talked to Zita about is, is there an opportunity to kind of build some of those out? I think it would be valuable to have some of those. So I don't have any of those in my hip pocket, but I'd be really thrilled to kind of try to build some of those out to make those case studies more accessible to this community.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think one of the things that we can do, is to bring us at the to the table, both the academics and industry, and work together to try to come up with some of these solutions or some of these answers, and so that we can all have access to it. Do you have any last minute thoughts for us? Anything that you want us that you'd like to talk about at this point?
No, I just reiterate that, again, assuming we have an academic audience and a lot of students, really think about, there's probably not, when you go to look at, the next step in your career or your life. I know when I was, in this position, I probably didn't think about these kinds of issues. You don't want to be asking your next potential employer, what do I do if I'm a whistleblower? That's just not going to come off right. But I think that notion of acknowledging that, you're probably going to be where I expect, folks who are attending a lecture like this would expect to work in an environment where you have a lot of discussion, and you don't always have agreement. And so, how is that handled professionally in your organization? And are there systems, practices, examples that people can show so that you can have a space that's safe for robust discussion, and outcomes that satisfy everyone. I think that's probably, and I'm not necessarily articulating it as well as I'd like to, but it's probably would suit folks well to be thinking about that and trying to better gauge the culture you're going to find yourself in, rather than after the fact learning that you're in a situation that doesn't necessarily fit your needs that way.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. We've got about 10 minutes. If there are any questions, please go ahead and type them in the Q&A box, and we'd be happy to answer. And thank you. I really appreciate the fact that you've shared your time with us. Is it possible to have access to your slides, as some of the audience are asking
Sure.
about?
I'll share those with you, Azita, and we can distribute those to the participants. Absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you again. I'm looking at the Q&A box and I don't see any other questions. So I guess you did an awesome job. No, there are no questions at this point. So we'll wrap this up. I want to thank you very much for again sharing the time. The OEC's director, Dr. Rosalind Byrne, and our coordinator, Courtney Walker, who's in the back here and is saving our lives. So thank you all. Really appreciate everyone being here and listening to us. Thanks again. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.